really is going to mark one of the last meetings that's primarily focused on education, and John Bennett's going to talk to us a little bit about that. But want to welcome you here. We are going to spend a few minutes going over the agenda and the meeting purpose, and then we are going to jump right into our panel discussion. So with that, I will invite John Bennett up to go over those things. Thank you, John.
After our safety panel, we're going to briefly review the community values that you identified in the last big meeting we had on April 29th. A lot of interesting common themes arose out of your 5 working groups. I should say the last breakout opportunity we had. Then later in today's meeting, we're going to break out again into the small groups to work essentially on 2 things. The first is to reflect on the safety discussion you're going to hear today, and to discuss what you heard and what it means to our future airport planning. And the second is to preview our next big meeting, which is on July 11th, when we'll begin really sinking our teeth into the details of airport planning. And we know that many of you are impatient to get on with that, and believe me, we share your enthusiasm and desire to do exactly that. So, in the interest of brevity, I will now turn this over to our co-chair, Meg Haynes, who will introduce our panel. Thanks.
Thank you, John. If the panelists, can you hear me? If the panelists will come forward, please. Greg Feith, Wayne Hall, and Alex Siebel. We're delighted to have you all, specialists. Please have a seat. Have it also right here. Again, thank you for being here today. Our vision process begins to look forward, exploring the continuum of options for potential airport updates this coming summer. We first want to make sure, though, that we have all the information we need about safety. So today's session is designed to address the safety questions. This is, as John said, the last piece of critical information sharing. After tonight, you all will be rolling up your sleeves and beginning to work. So we are going to begin by having the 3 panelists address questions that were sent in by you before we start the meeting. And if you don't mind, I'll be the moderator, read the questions, they will give you their answers, and if you'll hold your questions until they are finished with the 14 questions that we're going to go through, then we will have an open Q&A for all of you. So, given that, I want formally to let you know that Greg Feith is the former senior air safety investigator of National Transportation Safety Board, better known as NTSB. Greg, thank you. Wayne Hall is our air traffic manager in the Aspen County Airport Control Tower. Very hands-on person who knows what's going on. And Alex Siebel is the president of Flight Tech Engineering. John Kinney will be here, and Elizabeth McQueen and John Peacock if we have questions for them. So John is here in the audience with us. So these are some of the questions, gentlemen, that were sent in. If you will, I will read the question and then try to keep it. We only have 14 questions, but maybe 2 to 3 minutes per question. First one is, and they are categorized, so under the category of safety questions related to aircraft performance, the first question is, AOPA and Honeywell Aerospace studies list ASE as the #1 challenging airport in the country. How does that rating influence the kind of equipment that is safe to fly in here? For example, what is the turning radius of different designs, and at what speed and load in case of an aborted landing or takeoff? Is ASE an unsafe airport? Alec and Greg, that maybe seems to apply to one of you.
We'll start with Alec.
Sure. You want to do mic or to speak?
Here you are. Yeah.
Okay.
What do you want to do?
Hello, everyone. See if I can not to burst your eardrums here. So AOPA and Honeywell Aerospace studies, those studies are First of all, they're trying to raise awareness to the issue with Aspen. It's certainly a challenging location, and they're trying to draw attention to that. As a result of that awareness, it is intended to spur additional awareness about the airport and for training.
With regard to what AOPA is talking about with the challenges coming into Aspen, of course, it really deals on the general aviation side of the house. Honeywell is looking at the larger aircraft operations, the business type jets, charter aircraft, and then of course the commercial air carriers. One of the biggest problems that we see, at least in the general aviation market with light jets on down, is the cause and effect of weather-related accidents. Right now, that's still the #1 cause of aircraft accidents in the GA realm. And then, of course, you add that into operating here in a challenging terrain environment of Aspen. So you put those two together, and of course, AOPA is trying to bring a lot of awareness to that. Honeywell, on the other hand, looking at larger aircraft coming in here in those same challenging environments, while the aircraft may be able to handle the performance aspects of out-climbing terrain and flying the approaches. It is those odd times, that is a balked landing, where you have a crew that may not have the qualifications, that is special qualifications that you would find from an airline, or even some of the higher end charter operators and business operators. They may not have those special quals, have a familiarity with flying in and out of here, and they put themselves in a position of jeopardy, not necessarily the airplane, but the flight crew itself getting themselves because of their unfamiliarity with the in and outs of Aspen.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, go.
No, I think I'm good.
You want, please?
Well, I was just going to say, how does the rating influence the type of equipment? The Honeywell and aerospace, AOPA and Honeywell aerospace studies don't necessarily influence that rating. It's the FAA and their rules and regulations, how they design the approach procedures that influence the type of equipment that is safe to fly here. For example, the approaches that are designed for Aspen are limited to a certain approach speeds. And the FAA has done that to ensure that aircraft that can't operate at Aspen well are self-limited from flying here. So just to add that, thanks, Greg.
Okay. Are larger or smaller aircraft inherently any safer or easier to maneuver in the approach and departure airspace around ASE? I think that's a Greg and Alec question also. You want to try that one?
I'll start it.
Sure.
You can chime in. You can chime in, Alec. When you're flying the approaches, as Alex said, there are criteria that the FAA has put together. Wayne and his folks have to prescribe that kind of information to a flight crew coming in. They're going to have a paper chart. Wayne and his crew are responsible for making sure that these folks in some way, shape, or form have sufficient information to execute the approach. But the onus is on the pilot in flying their particular aircraft. Every aircraft is different. A small single pilot light jet like a Citation jet is going to have a better performance as far as turn radius than a G650 or a 737. Especially with what we call escape maneuvers or extraction maneuvers, balk landing. So again, these approaches are built with margins of safety. There's a whole volume called TERPS criteria that these approaches are built to. That's what Alec is referenced, and that is that every category of aircraft has certain speeds, certain climb gradients and descent gradients, performance aspects that must be met before that aircraft can actually operate in and out of here. The airlines may up that standard, business aviation operators may up that standard, charter operators may up that standard, but the FAA is the one that sets the standard for the operation in this airport.
Yeah, I agree with that. The procedures are currently regulated by the FAA and designed for the group of aircraft that are operating in here. Sure, the larger aircraft from a perspective of maneuvering are going to be probably harder to maneuver down on the ground than they are in the approach and departure procedure. Otherwise, since they're the large aircraft are still self-limited by the approach that can fly in here. The procedures are already built and designed to handle those type of larger aircraft. Yeah.
And again, we're talking about equipment. We're talking about a piece of hardware. It's kind of like your car. As long as you know that the car is operational and it's capable of climbing that mountain and doing the things that it needs to do, it has good brakes, then it's really not the car that may fail, but the driver may fail in the operation of that vehicle with excessive speed, improper braking, improper maintenance. So when we look at flying in and out of here, aircraft that are flying in and out of here are being flown by humans. And it is the human frailty, the human aspect that I see on a quite regular basis. We saw that with the Challenger accident, bad decision making. We saw that with the Gulfstream 3 off the end of the runway. We've seen it with a lot of the accidents, basically probably 99.8% of the accidents that have happened in and around the Aspen area all have a human error effect to them. It wasn't necessarily a failure of the hardware. The airplane's only going to do what the pilot wants it to do.
Does performance data exist for the newest regional jets, specifically the CRJ 550, the E175SC, and the prototype Mitsubishi MRJ 70? If not, when do we expect such data to be available? Alec?
Sure. So yeah, this is an interesting topic. The MRJ 70, the Mitsubishi, MRJ 70 and MRJ 90 are currently in flight test and certification. They're working with the larger MRJ 90 at this time to go through certification. There's no U.S. operators currently flying it. There's been some interest in it, but until we get a U.S. operator actually flying, I think the first operator is going to be a Japanese airline that's flying it. We won't have good data on the performance. They need to make it through certification first. So more to come on that. I also wanted to mention, especially as we talk about the MRJ 90 as well as some of the Embraer 175 fleet, is that these aircraft are larger aircraft. They're over 76 seats. They're over 86,000 pounds, and they can be limited by a pilot scope clause, which currently prevents the regional airlines, from flying aircraft that are over 76 seats and a certain weight, the 86,000 pound number. So it means that these aircraft would have to be flown by mainline operators such as United, Delta, others. And so that's sort of a shift that we're carefully watching to see how that dynamic changes. It certainly is possible that we could see these new entrants to the market. Let's see, on the Embraer 175 route, the current Embraer 175, and I think the person who asked the question was asking about the Embraer 175 SC. That is just a variation, a 70-seat variation of the current Embraer 175, which is a 76-seat aircraft. That aircraft, it is capable. It's currently not flying here, so we're definitely going to watch to see what the real-world numbers are at some point when an airline decides to bring it in. It is limited, though. It's a little bit heavier than the CRJ 700, and the research currently that we worked with American Airlines as part of the Air Service study indicated that it would take a greater passenger hit, especially during warmer temperatures in the summertime, and would be limited in the markets that it could serve. It would only be able to serve shorter range markets. So for example, current O'Hare service, Chicago O'Hare or Atlanta service would be affected greatly on the 175. As a result of its lower capacity, weight carrying capacity in the summer months. So that's certainly something to consider from a planning perspective. And then lastly, we've got the CRJ 550. This is an interesting concept. It is essentially a CRJ 700. It is not a new airframe that's being produced. It's a creative solution to allow the airlines to be able to bring on more Embraer 175s into the fleet and take delivery of those, because that's the aircraft that is preferred from a passenger experience. It is not a new airframe, so they're just taking seats out of the airframe, so it still has the same performance. It's certainly capable of operating here at Aspen, but from a traffic perspective now, you're losing seat capacity. It's going to take more of those flights to replace a 700 than if you just were to operate a 700 or an Embraer 125. The initial launch market for that plane is going to be on the East Coast, high density business class markets for the CRJ 550, and we haven't heard plans to bring it out to the West Coast. Certainly, it could change. It's certainly just initially being introduced at United as of right now, but we'll keep a close eye on that as it progresses. I'm trying to think. That is, yeah, I think that's the complete question there. Yep.
That's a good, thorough answer. Thank you. We've had a lot of questions about those, so
Sure.
thank you for that. If Aspen upgrades its airport to full Group 3 status, and this accommodates larger commercial aircraft such as Airbuses and 737s, would these aircraft be able to safely abort a landing from low altitude and go around if they needed to on a single engine? Alec and Greg again.
So
Greg is
oh, okay, sure. So the question is can these larger aircraft be able to go around if they were to abort from a low altitude position over the runway? It's a good question. It's something that all the airlines have to plan for, especially for Part 121, we call airline operations, have to consider this for going into Aspen. So this is what's really going to drive the final fleet selection that actually ends up flying here. If the airport is expanded to that Group 3 capability, each individual airline has to perform the analysis themselves. They look at a bulk landing, so this is over the threshold, in case there's something that goes out on the runway, a deer goes out on the runway, or they get a wind event that causes them to not be able to create a stabilized landing. They go around. That information is based on the altitude and the temperatures that exist at the time of what the planned landing is. And each airline has an engineering performance department that carefully reviews this to look and see if now they have to restrict the weight of the aircraft in order to be able to do that bulk landing. So there's a good possibility that yes, the larger airplanes could land here, but they may or may not require a weight restriction. Some of the smaller narrow bodies had the performance to be able to go in and do the bulk landing without a weight restriction. Some of the larger narrow bodies would have had to theoretically take a weight restriction of their landing weight to be able to land and perform the bulk landing procedure.
Good, Alex. I mean, that was it. What Alex was talking about, of course, is the fact that the airlines are going to have to weigh the penalties. On a day like today, the density altitude out there is pushing 10,000 feet. That's going to have a severe penalty on the ability of any size aircraft out there to operate in and out of the airport, and then, of course, with range and payload. So that will be an airline decision as to what equipment will fit into these particular markets during these seasonal periods. Can the airplane handle it empty, going out light? Absolutely. Again, it all depends on the pilot or the pilots executing a procedure, as Alex said. In this bulk landing where you come right over the threshold, you're in the touchdown phase, you're in the flare, and you have to go missed. There is no procedure as there is for the prescribed missed approach procedure. So now the airlines, the private operators, are coming up in basically a no-man land to come up with a prescribed procedure. Now the question is, can that airplane meet those kinds of performance requirements to outclimb the terrain at the opposite end of the runway? All of that has to be looked at and considered in the safety equation, other than just, can we haul people and baggage in and out of here from here to Newark?
Thank you. The Boeing 737 MAX 8, in addition to its tragic and well-publicized design flaws, is apparently unable to operate at, in quotes, hot/high airports. Does our airport meet the definition of a hot/high facility? Are other existing larger regional jets subject to the same operational limitations? If larger jets are allowed, will that not put pressure on the curfew? since aircraft would want to wait for cooler, late, or very early morning and evening temperatures to help mitigate the density altitude issue. Wayne, I think we'll call on you first.
There's no doubt the 737 was a tragic thing. But the bottom line is the airplanes, when they're planning on coming into Aspen, the crews are going to determine how much weight they can land with here. And on a hot, high day, density altitude like we were talking about, they have to take a hit on that, and they may have to dump some passengers in Denver or something. We're talking about customer experience now, and not so much is it a safe thing to do or not. They make the concessions and make the business case on whether to bring that airplane into the airport or not during those hot days.
And I'll just talk about the MAX. There's a lot of misinformation out there. I've been trying to educate the public for the last 6 months about this. It is not necessarily a design flaw. The system worked as operated. There are software issues, but there's more or less pilot training issues. That's what caused both of these accidents thus far. There's a lot of information out there. That airplane can operate in high and hot environments under certain conditions, just like every other airplane out there. They all have limitations. A Cessna 172, single engine propeller plane out here, has a limitation on a hot, high altitude day. So there are certain limitations, as Alex and Wayne talked about. The fact is that the airlines in a commercial service operation, business aviation operators or charter operators, all have to factor that in, whether or not the airplane is appropriate for the mission during that period of time. The performance is going to dictate what they can carry, who they can carry, how much they can carry, and whether they can operate safely in and out of the airport.
Yeah, and I'll just add, pretty much that summed it up, but I'll just add that this doesn't just affect the larger regional jets or even narrow bodies aircraft. It's something that is currently affecting, even today, probably the aircraft, the smaller CRJ 700s that's taking off out of Aspen now, that they're having to factor, look at the performance and make adjustments. I'm sure probably some of you have experienced this at one time or another, departing out of here, having to, or even at Denver coming in here, deal with the offload of passengers as a result of those density altitude weight restrictions.
Thank you. We'll now turn to safety questions that was submitted related to airspace. Is the airport's airspace expandable, in quotes, or is it at its maximum based on the unique characteristics of the airport, the proximity of Eagle Vale and other factors? Wayne, you want to speak to that?
I'm happy to speak to that, and it's an interesting question. It's a good question. The bottom line is we have plenty of airspace now. We can hold airplanes, we can vector airplanes, we have plenty of airspace to do all of that. What would change with a new fleet or with a moved runway? Very little from our perspective. So I'd say we have plenty of airspace. We don't see any need to expand airspace based on anything we're talking about here. That said, if we found an operational advantage to anything, we can request and we could get more airspace if we need it. Maybe not low over Eagle because Eagle needs that airspace, but we control all the way over to Grand Junction, above Eagle, we go out to Leadville and all the way south of Aspen. So our airspace is pretty expansive already. I don't see any need to expand it, and if we need to, we will.
I think that sums it up nicely.
If the Aspen Airport needs to increase the separation between its runway and taxiway, would moving the runway west increase the hazard represented by shale bluffs? For safety reasons, would moving the taxiway east make more sense than moving the runway west? Wayne?
I'll answer the question as best as I can anyway. This is a little bit out of my expertise. But from my perspective, the runway shift to the west is de minimis. It's very little difference out there. And Shale Bluff is in a visual area of all the approaches, so the airplanes have to have that terrain in sight. It's really not much different than a radio tower or a big building on the approach to any airport in any city. So there's that to be said. It's in a visual segment. Moving it to the east in order to keep it away from Shale Bluff, well, now we're compressing more airplanes, more people, and more stuff into a more condensed area. And I think that, my opinion, is that kind of is a bigger safety issue than a small shift to the west.
Alec?
Sure, yeah, really quick, we looked at this extensively as part of the initial air service study. We looked at moving all of the procedures over. Currently, the 80-foot shift to the west for both the departure and approach side. As Wayne said, at the Shale Bluff is in what we call the visual portion of each of those segments. The pilot has to have that in sight. The controlling obstacles for all these procedures are actually farther out to the north of the field, and by the time they're at the Shale Bluff, they're zeroed in and focused on landing or maneuvering for departure. And on that note, for departure, they are heading out to the northeast away from the Shale Bluffs, even with the runway shift.
Greg, you want?
I was just going to say that when we look at the separation and the movement of the runway, we got a runway right now in its place, and we lost the G3 that was offset to that runway, tried to make a correction at low altitude, half mile off the end of the runway. Is there always the potential that something like that can happen again with the runway shifted? Absolutely. You can't write a regulation or put a procedure in that's going to ever prevent that. But with what Wayne and Alec have said, when the FAA has evaluated moving it to the west, the Shale Bluffs do not present any kind of obstruction issue with the aircraft. However, again, it's one of those things where moving the runway, opening up the separation is to a larger wingspan airplanes. And we talked about this morning, and that is that a bit of a misnomer. Longer wings mean bigger airplanes, not necessarily. Longer wings on airplanes are built for efficiency. That's why the 650 can fly for 8 hours and 8,000 miles and that kind of thing. And so you need that ground separation so that you're not hitting wingtips with each other. So that's the safety concern on the ground. But again, you bring all of these airplanes in, you only have a limited footprint at this airport. So where are you going to put those airplanes? As far as the approach is concerned, every pilot's going to be able to fly the approach. It's whether they fly it properly and execute properly.
A lot of pressure on the pilots.
It's all up to them.
Are there any other Colorado airports at equivalent ASE elevation that take commercial traffic? Alec?
Sure. So there are some that, especially some that are at similar elevation. So just a couple of those that we thought of off the top of our heads were Yampa Valley, which is near Steamboat at 6,600, Durango at 6,685, Gunnison Crested Butte, which is actually the closest to Aspen at 76, 78. And just for reference, Aspen is at 7820. And there's one that is actually higher, which is Telluride, which just started up commercial jet service a few weeks ago, which is at 9,070 feet.
Okay, we're almost halfway or past halfway with our questions. We're under the category of safety questions related to ASE's ability to implement site-specific safety standards. Since all accidents have been private GA aircraft, can we direct private GA flights to Rifle, a much more user-friendly valley and altitude? Wayne?
The short answer is no. Aspen's a public use airport. That's the way it's designed, and that's the way we operate out of here. Our understanding, anytime a pilot asks to land at Aspen, that he knows what he's doing. He's trained, he's professional, and he's going to follow the procedures. Does everybody do that? No. But our assumption going into it is that they do. We have no way of policing whether a pilot has landed at Aspen in the last year or not. But it's, like you said, on the pilot. It's a pilot responsibility to make sure they've briefed this airport, they understand the go-around procedures, they understand everything they need to do to make a safe landing here.
I'll just add that when the FAA is looking at these challenges to an airport like this, of course, the onus is on the pilot. The airlines have special use, they've classified this as a special use airport, they get specialized training. A lot of my business aviation clients, all of their flight crews, when they go to flight safety, have special use airport training because they're flying into a number of challenging airports, not only here in the States, but around the world. That isn't a blanket statement. That's not enforceable by the FAA for every pilot to have this special use training. It is about education. It is about trying to get the information out. Wayne can only give a pilot so much wind information. He can't say go away because this airport is a public use airport. It is up to the pilot to determine whether or not it is safe to complete or execute the approach and landing. If it isn't, it's on them to declare the missed and go somewhere else or do something else. All they can do is provide information services and separation for these aircraft. And again, it's the execution. You can have a bad pilot flying a bad approach or a bad executed missed approach. That is always going to be there. It's a human factors issue. But when you look at, the type of aircraft, 757s aren't coming in here. They can land on that runway. They can operate off of an 8,000-foot runway. Do they have the safety margins? No. And that's really what's going to dictate what happens at this airport is by a natural limitation. The runway, as I talked with John this morning, that runway is at its maximum length. That, by natural selection, is going to limit the type of aircraft that are in and out of here based on the performance. So there are some natural things that will limit the scope and the size of the aircraft operating in and out of this airport.
This next question is kind of getting at the same thing, but maybe in a little bit differently. Because ASE is rated by some pilot surveys as being the most challenging airport in the U.S., could the FAA require GA pilots flying into Aspen for the first time to review special informational material about approaching and departing from the airport and the various unique challenges of flying in and out of ASE? If the FAA cannot require GA pilots to review such information, could such information be made available online as an option for GA pilots to review before flying to ASE? Wayne, Greg?
You're right. It's a similar answer to the last one. Pilots are professional. The people that are flying these jets around are professionals. They and a professional person will do the legwork required to do a safe operation. That includes pre-briefing before they take off. What's our landing weight at Aspen? How much fuel can we have on the airplane when we get there? All these things are pre-briefed. Is this a complex airport? Yes, it is. And pilots are required by their profession, and by profession, they live by an oath to do, the professional thing in their job. And so we expect them to behave that way. And the vast majority of them do, in my opinion. And I think that most of these, everybody else would agree with me on that. The part about is information available? So no, there isn't anything I can send them to that the FAA publishes and says, you have to view this before you go to Aspen. But there is a plethora of information out there online. There's YouTube videos, there's websites devoted to Aspen, and it's by people that are passionate about it, they know about it, and there's a lot of good information out there. It just takes a pilot to do a Google search to find this information.
The FAA, as they've said, cannot regulate anything, but there could be a petition circulated by the folks here in Aspen to the FAA. There's special use airspace now around Washington, D.C. after 9/11. As a pilot, you must go through online training on the FAA's website, go through that training, and get a certificate with a little placard that goes in your wallet with your pilot certificate that gives you a specific PIN number that says that you did attend this training online, that you are familiar with the airspace limitations, the permissions that are necessary to operate in and out of the special use airspace. They force that on every single pilot. The airlines have a special training, but business aviation, charter operators, and general aviation pilots, I fly out of Gaithersburg, which is my home airport when I'm not here. I have to call, file a flight plan. There's a specific procedure. I cannot just get in the airplane and fly VFR without having a specific ID. So if you're really passionate about it, you can petition the FAA to see if they could invoke some sort of training method like that that requires online training. I think it would be probably like banging your head against the wall, but there's always that option if there is really an issue with operating in and out of here in a challenging environment.
We all know Aspenites aren't shy about putting petitions together. So that's a bit of a challenge, perhaps. Landing in high tailwind has caused general aviation accidents and near accidents at ASE. Could the Aspen Tower give more strongly worded warnings to GA aircraft when potentially dangerous tailwinds pose a threat? Could the tower actually direct an aircraft to go around if the tailwind is excessive? You see the theme of these questions, right?
Yeah, I do. I'm going to answer the last question first. Can I send an airplane around because I see a high wind situation? No, I don't know what qualifications that pilot has. I don't know what his aircraft is capable of. The only person that knows that is the pilot. They have the best information. In fact, I'm not allowed to withhold a landing clearance. If somebody feels like they need to land, I'm obligated to give them a landing clearance. That's the rule. We have to make a way for them to land the airplane. Aspen has some of the most stringent wind information out there. Our ATIS every day, because the wind's always favoring one runway or the other, we have to tell you this: use caution, dangerous tailwind conditions for runway 15, or use caution, runway 15 tailwind conditions exist. Every pilot hears that every time they come in here. As every controller, if there's a tailwind situation on arrival, the first controller at Aspen has to remind the pilot, hey, there's a tailwind for the runway. We get an acknowledgement. If we don't, we tell them again until we get an acknowledgement. When they talk to the last controller before they land with a landing clearance, they get the wind again. We're very, very careful about that. We give wind a lot here. On a departure, if there's a tailwind, we tell them, use caution, strong tailwinds for runway 33. Ground controller taxis them out, tells them the wind again. Tower controller issues them the wind again with the takeoff clearance. I don't think we can do much more than that. Either you guys want to?
In addition to the tailwinds, I know that you don't have much of a crosswind. There is crosswinds up here, but not to the extent that we see down in Denver. And if you remember, about 6 years ago, there was a Continental 737 blown off the side of the runway during departure at Denver International Airport. And that was because of 45-knot crosswind blowing across the runway. Again, the controllers can only give the pilots the wind. It is up to, of course, the pilots to do the mental gymnastics to determine whether or not that airplane is capable of handling those specific wind conditions. And while they have a responsibility, their responsibility is not to fly the airplane. That's the pilot's responsibility. That's where the safety issue comes in, because the demographic of pilots flying in and out of airports like Aspen are varied across the board. And that's why it's so hard to quantify or qualify. If we do this, it'll make the airport safe. We can't. But you got to look at all of the factors. And when it comes to the size of the aircraft, some pilots could make an airplane dance like a 737 and put it down and take it off without ever having a problem, even if they have a single engine issue. Others will have a real challenge trying to outclimb that terrain out there. So again, the onus is on the operator, the operation, and of course the crew on that airplane.
3 more questions and we'll be done. This is under the category of emergency management and safety data questions. Is there an accurate and accessible record of all airplane accidents into ASE in the last 10 years? Greg?
You got to qualify that. Is that a 5 nautical mile ring, a 10 nautical mile ring, or a 25 nautical mile ring? Because I've done accidents in basalt Does that, I mean, they came out of Aspen. So do you include those kinds of accidents? I've done accidents that where an airplane was leaving Denver coming to Aspen with the intent of landing here, never made it past the front range. So you got to qualify that. I did the accident, the Aero Commander that crashed in Basalt. I did the 404 that crashed on Highway 82. I did the Richmore Learjet, Lear 35 that crashed. I was involved with the FedEx airplane that crashed up in Starwood. So, I mean, I've done a number of these larger aircraft accidents. Are we looking at small general aviation, or are you looking at just commercial operation? Yes, we have had a number of different types of accidents. And to say, yeah, there were 30 accidents, Aspen is a dangerous airport. You can't do that. It's just like saying the MAX, the 737 MAX is a dangerous airplane. There's 7,000 737s flying. It's just a variant. So you have to really get specific. What is it that you're looking for? And I guarantee you that if you look at common denominators, it all resides in the cockpit and works backwards.
We're almost concluding on some of the negative questions, but I'll go. We might have one positive one at the end. I'll go to John Kinney on this one. Can we deal with an emergency crash of a 737? John?
Thanks, Meg. 737 seating capacity, it varies, but to use the lower number, which is kind of the size of aircraft that would come into this airport if it could, around 135. So in emergency management, you plan around a reasonable worst case scenario, not the most catastrophic that you can think of, but what is a reasonable worst case scenario? Then you build your core capabilities around that. And so what we have as our reasonable worst case scenario is two 700s colliding. So approximately 140, 130 type passengers. The more complicated version is that you would have a lot of people have to be transported as opposed to those who are deceased. It's not as time sensitive. So we work with our mutual aid partners that includes the fire departments, the police departments, emergency medical services, hospitals in the area. On an annualized basis, we exercise those plans. We also do it on a triannual basis, and each one of those exercises is dictated by the FAA. And on a triannual basis, we have a full-scale exercise where we actually have equipment responding. We bring out simulators with fuselages, and they have a sprinkler system inside that doesn't shoot water, it shoots fire. So the people are crawling into and out of these fuselages in total darkness, completely filled with smoke, and having to retrieve 150, 165-pound dummies and having to get them out. So it is very real. It is very intense. And we do that, as I said, on an every 3-year basis. If you think of emergency management program, it's very similar to that of what took place at the Lake Christine fire. All resources were engaged, and then we went to a regional level, a state level, and even beyond outside of our state to bring in those type of resources. And that's what would happen to if an event of that magnitude happened at this airport. Every event is scalable, and you simply activate it and go out further with concentric rings, bringing in more resources. We also have an airlift component with fixed wing and rotor wing that we bring part of our triennial exercise, and it's simulated taking people down to Denver, taking people down to Grand Junction, taking people down to Glenwood Springs. So it really is a big event, and there's a lot of existing relationships that are practiced and worked. So that's our plan.
We had talked about this morning, and that is a natural process for an airport, is to run these emergency response drills, have a live response drill every 3 years. But one of the things I thought about this morning was, because of the environment here, because of what we're talking about here, is incorporating possibly a scenario where you have the airplane that is off airport 3 miles or 2 miles into Ajax or somewhere around there, because that's going to require a whole different emergency response plan, use of mutual aid, concentric ring resources, and that kind of stuff. So besides just, because it's real easy to just drive up, like we saw with the Challenger, put the ARF trucks out there and take care of what's happening on the runway. But if we lose an airplane, on a balked or a balked landing, and the airplane goes down a mile or 2 miles off the end of the runway, it's a different set of resources. And I think from our discussion this morning, that would be a valuable training exercise, because you may use mountain rescue and a bunch of other folks in that kind of scenario versus just pulling up and having the immediate resources. So those are some of the safety concerns that as you bring in these bigger airplanes, you have to plan for those types of events as well.
I happened to be the president of the Aspen Valley Hospital when we had that last private calamity, and I will ditto everything that John says. I was amazed at how quickly all of the community resources rallied to see about that terrible thing. Last question, John. What interim safety improvements are we doing, or can we do now, since the terminal won't be built for over 5 years? We're going to look at the future and what we can do positively. And what we're doing now also.
Well, we're planting flowers this week. Beautiful flowers, I'm mad. Heavily landscaped. But in addition to that, we recently, we've been monitoring it very closely because our flights have been increasing steadily over the last several years. And so we're really bumping our head up against the fire code and just the density of people during those peak periods inside the terminal area, whether it be the ticketing or the TSA line or beyond the TSA checkpoint, which we call the sterile area where you wait to board your flight, or inside baggage claim. So we have dialed that back to maximize safety, make it reasonable, so if people did have to evacuate that terminal in a time-sensitive event, they could do so in a very safe manner. But the loss of capacity is around about 100, 110 passengers. So to retain that and get that back, yet not increase the footprint of the terminal building, we're going to be making some improvements that we still have to get before the Board of County Commissioners, but we're looking at taking the administrative offices and converting that to a sterile area, passenger boarding lounge area. Also taking a look at a temporary structure, tent, if you will, just on the outside, still airside, on the baggage claim area. So when you get those 2, 3, 4, sometimes up to 800 bags that are delayed because of diverted flights to Grand Junctions, and they are bussed in, trucked into the airport, we have to put those somewhere other than the footprint inside where people would occupy, because it would lower our fire code even further. So that's in play as well, but we're still in the design phase of that to take that before the Board of County Commissioners. In the meantime, we've added staff over the last several years, safety and security folks. We've created a very complex security access control system with closed circuit TVs so that we now can instantly ascertain who's coming, who's going. If somebody blows through a door or does some illegal type activity, we have that on record, and we can respond accordingly to the individual was a young, very young looking woman in a dark blue shirt that just blew through the door. We now can find her on the ramp. Whereas before we're like, we don't know who did it. And you go out on the ramp and there's 100 people. It's like meeny, mo. So you would have to dump everybody out of the airport back onto the land side. So those are some of the improvements that we've done, and the lifespan of those will take us over the next 3 or so years. We also did change the orientation, so if this was the terminal building behind me and you were going into it, the aircraft used to be parked parallel to the terminal building. Now they're parked perpendicular. The nose is straight in. And that was a safety issue because the aircraft that were turning were using their thrust of their engines to accelerate out, and it was creating huge jet blast and really causing a problem for those passengers walking on the ramp. So just a variety of things that we've done, as well as line management. So if you noticed, you've never read in the newspaper, passengers missing flights left and right. It's because we're doing line management. So we're metering people coming into the airport, and then those who need to get into the sterile area to get on the airplane first are being cherry-picked. The 100 people out of the 400 people waiting, we're cherry-picking them and getting them through the TSA checkpoints that they get on the flights and leave. So it's a very unorthodox, very unusual format, but it's responsive and people are not missing their flights. And once they kind of get the rules of the game, they buy into it because they get to go on their flight. So those are some of the things that we're doing.
Thank you. think we all agree Aspen likes unorthodox activities also. Thank you, John. Thank you, the panelists, all of you, for sitting quietly while they answered the questions. I'll now turn it over to John Peacock so that you all can ask your questions.
All right, thank you, Meg. So we've got about 40 minutes planned right now so that you can really ask any questions that you'd like. Before we get into questions, I also just want to elaborate on the emergency management preparedness, because there are efforts that happen that are specific to the airport that John talked about. And to Greg's point, the county also has an emergency management function that supports the airport, but we also practice other kind of mass casualty events because the airport is not the only place this community is at risk. Of course, we have major special events, whether that be the X Games or Food and Wine, which is about to come up, or what have you, which could be subject to mass casualty kind of events. From weather, from folks with bad intent and such. And so we do practice and exercise to make sure that at a local, regional, state, and federal level, our emergency response and responders are coordinated. So I just wanted to add that in. With that, I think we have a couple of mic runners. We have Melissa and we have Miles. So I will start taking questions. I'll try and balance out the room. Valerie.
So you talked about that any new aircraft that would be coming in here would be thoroughly assessed by the airlines to decide whether or not it's capable of using this airport. So when will those pieces of information be available to us? In other words, when will we know if a 737 can actually land here? Would we know that before we have to decide whether to shift the runway?
Alec and Greg, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. Some of that information now for the aircraft types that currently exist and those capabilities are on the Air Service study that's posted on the website. For some of the information, or for some of the aircraft fleets that are still in certification or don't have U.S. operators, that may take some time, such as like the Embraer 175 E2, that next generation version, could be a few months. It could be up to a year before we'll have information as to that aircraft's capability. But the airlines, I believe, are gonna weigh in on this in future discussions, and that's really who we have to go to make that decision, because it's going to be based on their ultimate and final analysis of each new airframe's capability.
And passenger.
Yeah, and passengers. Yeah.
Do you want to add something? No, that's it. Wayne, did you want to add anything? No. Okay.
Did I answer your question? Or?
No. I just am concerned that an aircraft that we might be relying on, being the perfect one for here, ends up not being the perfect one for here. Yeah. And I just felt like we as a group that needs to make a recommendation on this really needs to have that final, airline data before we say, yeah, let's go with whatever.
So I'm just going to talk really loud. Just one of the things, and Alec, I think you may be able to comment on this, is we are going to be doing an update to the Air Services study and anticipated fleet mix, and that will be information that's available to the group. I don't know, Alec, if you're able to comment on that. Sure,
and to add to your question here, the current aircraft, which is a CRJ 700, we know that it has a limited lifetime. If we make no changes, we're going to be stuck with only a very limited amount of aircraft that could potentially operate in here, being the 175, which we know has a lot of restrictions. So if we decide not to move forward with any plans to expand the runway, then we'd be dealing with a potential loss of load capacity out of the airport, a loss of certain markets. So that'd be something to consider. We have that information already in the Air Service study for the 175 that you could reference.
Did you want to?
No.
Oh, I got scolded for not using the mic. So I'm going to go way in the back and then we'll come forward.
Sorry. Thank you. I have a question. If a private pilot who's never been to the Aspen airport before were to call and say they'd like to land, what procedure is there to let them know what they can and cannot do? I mean, can anyone land if they just happen to be flying by and decide they want to land?
Short answer is yes. And again, we expect most of these pilots to be professionals. The GA, when we're talking about GA, we're generally speaking at this airport, we're talking about jet operators. GA a lot of times means the single pilot, Bonanza or whatever. We don't see that much traffic here, and that's not going to change much with anything. I take a lot of those calls, though. People will call me and say, hey, is there anything I need to know? I refer them to these various websites that I'm aware of and say, yeah, Google it, get some good information before you come in here because it's a complicated airport. Don't come in here blind.
Okay, I think we had Bob here in the front. Keep your hand up, Bob, so we know where to go with it.
Thanks, John. On the aircraft feasibility assessment, it states that the 737-8 MAX might be suitable, a suitable airline, but relies on updating the existing approach procedures. So that, in my mind, starts to think about who has the authority to do that, and under what circumstances could those procedures not be updated?
So why don't we start with Alec and Wayne on that one?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, the 737 MAX, well, on paper, it can technically land here and operate out of the airport. Is it going to be feasible? Because that is a large 170-plus seat aircraft that is usually running to high-density markets. And sorry, the last part of your question was the approaches and who can modify those. Currently, that 737 MAX 8 is a Category D aircraft, just meaning it operates at a higher speed than what the current approaches are capable of, which is they're currently limited to Cat C or roughly 140 knots. In order to allow for that aircraft to come in, there would have to be changes to the instrument approach procedures. The FAA initiates those procedures. The airlines can also privately develop those procedures. That's very specific to them. But it's also worth noting that even some of the smaller regional jets, such as the Embraer 175, are also Category D because they have just their wing design, their fuselage design puts them into a higher speed category. Now, the 737 MAX 8 is obviously a little bit faster than the 175, but no matter what, the procedures will most likely have to be redesigned to be able to handle that.
There's another part to the question.
By the FAA, yeah.
So what options do the airport operator have to determine or to whether those procedures are or are not updated? Obviously, if they're not updated, then the 737 MAX isn't coming. So how does that work? Is there any option locally to choose not to update?
And so I'm sure John could probably speak to the ability to exclude certain type of operations, but the approach procedures that's purely in the realm of the FAA. If the airport is capable of it from a design perspective, then they can implement those Category D additions to the airport, allowing aircraft such as the newer smaller regional jets that are actually in that Category D. Will they probably be able to modify the original approaches as of now? Probably not. They may have to do something different, but the FAA will look at that and determine if it can be safely done before they implement it.
Anyone else want to add?
Oh, sorry, Wayne.
I would just say that, approach procedures, we always are looking at those all the time. We want to make them more efficient. We want to make them more successful. We want to make them safer. We're always looking at those things. So if there's And those decisions are based on airport design and terrain. They're not based on what kind of airplane is going to come in and out of here. They don't. We don't say there's a possibility of 737s. We don't want that, so we're going to make our approaches so they can't do it. No, we don't operate that way. We make our approaches based on terrain and airport layout and that sort of thing. And it's an evolution. We're constantly trying to make things better and safer. And I'll leave it. You want to add to that?
Thank you, guys. It's interesting, informative. You talked about the airspace, and as a general aviation pilot, small airplanes, what I'm seeing is that the airspace seems to me to really be shrinking and much more saturated. You know, during the high season, the big holidays, everything, almost every time I come in, and I'm flying a 210, which is not a, you know, real, I got some speed. I'm being held at Snowmass. Another guy's being held over the city. Guy's going right downwind to 3-3. And I know the FAA's got the regulation says there's plenty of airspace there, but you start to incorporate some of these big body guys or the 737. I see some real concerns there. And maybe you could address that.
Wayne, that's probably to you.
You're right. On those saturated days, I wouldn't encourage you to try to get into Aspen on a busy day. You're going to end up holding a lot. And that is just part of the way Aspen is. On our, you know, we see these days where we just absolutely reach the maximum numbers that we can possibly do. And holding over Snowmass, we find that's a good place to hold aircraft like yours, your 210, because you're out of the way of the missed approach and that sort of thing. So you're out of the way of problems that could develop, and that's why we choose those locations. And we'll pull you in a little closer when we think we have a hole for you, and then we finally will get you on the runway. Does that help?
Well, you guys do an incredible job with that. There's no doubt about that. But what we're talking about is the future. We're talking about implementing a whole different class of airplane. Not class, that's the wrong word. But a bigger airplane, wake turbulence, all kinds of avoiding flying near that jet blast, if you will, not on the ground, but, you know, in the air. And I just wonder, you know, maybe legally we got the airspace that you need, perfect, but it's going to get to be a practical consideration, I would think. And again, high compliments to your staff and people that work at that tower. But that's really not an option for some people who work with those airplanes, and they're coming in from Idaho or someplace like that, and all of a sudden you say, well, don't come in here. I mean, that's a very difficult situation. And we as local pilots do understand these heavy days, and I personally try to avoid or minimize the time I have to be in there, but there comes a point when what's next? And I think that has to be part of a conversation.
And I agree with you, with the exception of we're talking traffic volume and not necessarily aircraft size. Now, when you talk about wake turbulence and jet blast on the ground, yeah, I get that. And pilots are supposed to, and here I go talk about the pilot responsibility again. You know, you as a 210 pilot, no, you shouldn't be too close behind that CRJ that's ahead of you. And in the air, we do try to keep you and the larger aircraft separate anyway, even in today's world. So I have a hard time saying that larger airplanes are going to be harder for us to fit into our airspace. We don't operate on such tight tolerances. The size of the airplane matters very little from our perspective.
Okay, any more from here before we go back? I think I saw a hand up here.
Hi, thanks. I was wondering if part of this analysis anyone had looked at slight realignment of the proposed new runway to 3-4, for example, and whether that would avoid some of the descending air on approach. Whether there's any safety gains to be had.
I'm stepping a little bit out of my realm here. If you realign the runway, I think the general consensus is to turn the north end of the runway a little bit to the northeast, or vice the south end of the southwest. The problem is when we're working our opposite direction traffic, we need that fan, that array of areas. If we're shooting our departures straight out towards, I hate to say it, out towards Woody Creek or points east of Woody Creek, and that's the exact same place that our arrivals are coming from, we have a bigger problem than we have now with our opposite direction operation. The way it works now, our arrivals come in almost straight to the runway, our departures immediately turn, and we immediately have separation from that arriving airplane. If you move it to the, if you twist that orientation, I think we would lose our ability to do that. That said, it's probably a data decision to determine whether that is optimal or not. But I do believe personally that that would become a very limiting factor in our ability to move 300 airplanes a day.
And you may run into issues with all of your clear area off the ends of the runway. Right now, you have an overrun area, you move that 10 degrees, you're now headed more into Highway 82 if you have an aircraft overrun. That may breach, you know, certain protocols as well, so.
Thank you. At the Q&A this morning, there was some discussion regarding the regional jets that are coming online, the manufacturers are making in various configurations, and if I recall correctly, and I may not, the question was put in so many words, if the community and the airport, airport authority decided just to stick with the, what is it, 75 feet or 95 feet?
95.
The 95-foot wingspan limit, wouldn't we have available to us these new regional jets that would be able to take the place of the CRJ 700s as they time out and wind up going to the graveyards? And there was a response that you made, Alec, and maybe Greg and Wayne, you weighed in on that in terms of like whether there's, I mean, the 737 in a way is a red herring because there are a bunch of other planes that the thought was maybe could fill that gap. And my takeaway, rightly or wrongly, was that there's only one maybe, and right now that hasn't been demonstrated as being viable, and none of the carriers have bought that. So the answer was basically no. If you want to maintain the same level of service we have right now, we're going to have to go above the 95 feet to let those new regional jets, even though they're smaller, to maintain the current level of service. Could you expand on that? And if my takeaway was wrong on that, could you correct me?
Well, why don't we go in the order you suggested? We'll start with Alec and move to the right.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, absolutely. The trend we're seeing in the regional jet industry is that they're becoming larger. They're starting to look like mini Airbuses. If you keep things the way they are now, and continue accepting, you know, federal funds, you're limited to the CRJ 700 without bumping up into airport design category 3, which allows you to take advantage of the next generation of regional jets that are coming online, which are going to be the Airbus A220. You've got the Embraer, Embraer 175 E2 as well, which is roughly 100-foot wingspan. So we're seeing that trend. We aren't seeing a lot of new entrants into the market, or even airplanes being available that are in that 50 seat or lower than 76 seats. So yeah, if you stay where you are now, and if you go back or stay at design category 2, you'll be limited to just that CRJ 700, which has a limited lifespan. And the other issue is the current modification of standard that is currently in place now, which there's only two choices. Go to category airport design group 2, which limits you to the 76 seats, or the CRJ 700 wingspan length, or going to group 3 and taking advantage of the newer regional jets that have larger wingspans, and it also allows you to take advantage of some of these hybrid aircraft that are the transitions between regional and narrow bodies, such as the A220s.
Okay. And again, I think we talked about this morning, is that we're focused on the commercial operators, but you also have to look at commercial from the standpoint of charter operators operating a 650 or global. jet where their wingspans are over 100 feet. So you have to accommodate, and as Alex said, if you limit that to a 95-foot wingspan, you're going to lose capacity. Now, that gets into a whole growth discussion that you all had this morning, which is beyond the scope of this, but now all of a sudden, you've limited capacity, and if you don't have the airplanes or the airlines don't have the airplane to bring folks in here, now you have a whole different issue. So.
I'm just curious if you could touch on, we talked about safety issues on the approach and the departures, and we're talking about the runway. Another component of this is the terminal. Are there any safety issues and design issues in the eventual terminal design that would limit what airplanes could come out? For example, would a 737 require a skyway or something like that? Is there anything that we could possibly control through the eventual design of a terminal?
Okay, Alec?
Not quite the expert here on terminal design, but just a few things in regards to the Skyway. They can still board 737 narrow body Airbus type aircraft via air stairs. If you look at a place like Jackson Hole, they still board via air stairs there. So from that perspective, yes, a jetway, a skybridge is nice, but it's not an absolute deal breaker requirement. Certainly, the amount of airplanes that can come in are based on the amount of gate spaces that are available. And is that a mix of regional style jets and narrow bodies? I think that's up to the group and the teams to determine. Anyone else want to add?
It's based really on footprint size. I mean, John can address it, but if you got 4 737s parked next to each other, can it handle a fifth? That's going to be just a natural limitation, that there's only so much pavement out there to put these large aircraft. So that you could have only 5 gates because that's all the airport can accommodate versus 3. Can you park some off on a remote ramp and air stair? Yeah, but again, passenger experience, and that presents a new safety issue, especially in the wintertime, with icy ramps blowing and all of that kind of stuff. So there are a lot of peripheral safety issues with some of these alternatives.
Tom.
The question for John Kenny. The opening meeting, you announced that the United had purchased a new fleet of aircraft, and I was wondering what was that fleet under? Is that a CRJ 700 or was it a what? And what's the life of that new fleet?
That was the CRJ 550, and as a wise air service development consultant shared with me not too long ago, it is now being described as probably one of the more creative marketing pitches, because now what is coming out is that those are converted CRJ 700 aircraft and simply taking out the max number of seats down to about 50, 55, configuring them to a more luxurious first class, business class configuration, but it's still the same airframe, it's still the same aircraft that are flying today. When the first announcement came out, I think it was that day or the day before, our first visioning meeting where we talked about it, sounds like they're going to reactivate the manufacturing line. And that's what it led you to believe with a casual reader. So that has turned out to be more of an East Coast service, and it's the same aircraft that are in their fleet today. So it does not prolong the lifespan of the issues that these gentlemen were talking about.
Thank you.
I think noise is the thing that most of us are worried about, and the bigger the plane, the perception is the louder it is. And the 737 seems to be the one that most of us are focused on in terms of it being too loud, and we're trying to find angles to keep them out. Is there a safety angle or a terminal angle that we can use to keep them out, or are we being silly to have that concern?
Yeah, so Alec, maybe you could address the technology and noise issues, and then go into, I think, Scott, you're asking whether there's a safety concern around the noise that we could address here.
Maybe not the safety around the noise, but
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's a tough one. It is hard to exclude a certain type of aircraft if it's capable of coming in, and there's actually probably far better explanations for that. Some of these newer aircraft, such as the A220, actually have a very low noise footprint for the type of aircraft they are, that are very similar to actually regional jets. So that may be a solution or better alternative to the 737s, but excluding those from landing, by aircraft or by noise, I'm not aware of, other than I'm thinking of the old 727s, where they mandated those couldn't land. But yeah, that's what I've got. Anyone else want to add to that?
No, thanks.
An old Gulfstream 3 is louder than any airplane that's operating out there right now, just because of the turbojet engine versus the high bypass turbofans. Washington National, Reagan National Airport, they do have a noise abatement procedure coming into and out of that airport late at night because of all of the large houses along the Potomac River. You have to basically zoom climb to 1,500 feet AGL, level off, and then do a second segment climb for all intent and purposes once you've gotten down river out of that noise sensitive area. You could ask the FAA to do a feasibility study, I'm sure, about a noise footprint if those airplanes get too loud, especially going over Starwood or downtown or other noise sensitive areas. They would come out and do a noise study to see if a noise abatement procedure would be reasonable, logical, and capable.
We have 10 minutes. I'll be quiet the whole time if somebody doesn't ask a question. Ellen.
At previous meetings, staff has told us that peers in other counties are not interested in discussing mutual interests in planning, in airport planning coming up. My experience is different. I asked the Garfield County Commissioners, I went to public comments and said, do you want to be invited to the table, and talk about the possibility of getting more either general aviation or commercial in Rifle? And of course they couldn't commit to what the answer would be, except to say, yes, we want to be invited to the table. I also just read in the paper a week or so ago of all the improvements that have happened at Eagle Vale. I wasn't even aware of it, and I would have thought in this group we would have been apprised of what's happening, as the crow flies, only a few miles away. So this is, I kind of like a commitment from staff. Are you going to facilitate a meeting with our neighboring airports and talk about how we can serve the whole area? My sense is Aspen doesn't want to lose the very lucrative fuel business up here, and you don't want to have big jets or private jets go to Rifle. I'm being very upfront about this because it's a big business up here. However, it's a fact of life. We do make money on fuel up here. Perhaps they want to make money on fuel down there in Rifle. So my question is, can you commit to inviting our neighbors to the table, Rifle and Eagle?
Yeah, we're going down. I'm meeting with my counterpart and John Kinney's counterpart. They have expressed to us in no uncertain terms that commercial is not on the table for them. Okay. GA coordination is probably a different issue. We send a lot of business down there right now, as it turns out. Eagle County has moved forward with plans. There's probably that is a farther distance, different commercial kind of aspect, and that conversation is probably in a different profile than with Garfield County. What's that? We've been in conversations already with them.
It would be very helpful to me. I would like to attend and listen. Are these closed meetings? Or are they open to the public?
They've been at the staff level. So,
What
Ellen, I
what's
think you
the-
may be getting off of the safety topic, so I want to be sure that we leave time.
Well, no,
If we have a public
the way-
meeting with Garfield County, we'll be sure to apprise you of that if they show interest in
No,
that.
the way it fits in with
So-
safety is because in my experience, all of the crashes in the last 50 years have been general aviation. And it seems as if there's room for conversation, it's in the general aviation realm. So it dovetails.
Fair enough.
I'm hoping you can clarify a couple of things in the August 25th Airspace Impact and Aircraft Feasibility Assessment Update. It lists a couple of aircraft, the CRJ 700. It indicates the aircraft can feasibly operate prior to runway relocation. I assume you're talking about the current configuration. Isn't it operating here now?
Correct, yeah.
Then how is it feasible?
Correct. The CRJ 700 is currently operating right now. It does experience limitations from time to time based on weather conditions that are here, but it's just affirming that it can operate now, and it can also operate after the runway shift.
Okay, that was just confusing in terms of the feasibility because it is in fact operating, to clarify that.
Yep.
You evaluated the E175LR, but the SC was not available at that time, is that correct?
It was that study, the analysis for the 175 was provided by American, and they didn't happen to operate the SC version, which I believe is on the primarily on the Delta side. It's a difference between 70 and 76 seats due to scope clause issues. The SC configuration just means that special config for more three class cabin, so more first class and economy comfort and whatnot. That the difference in the aircraft weights are fairly negligible, and the performance was similar enough to where it didn't make sense to break it down into specific seating configurations.
But the question is, if it's feasible prior to runway relocation at a 76-seat configuration, wouldn't it make sense that a lighter 175 SC, somewhat lighter, would also meet that criteria? So we're not talking about potentially a single aircraft capable of serving us. SkyWest just took delivery of a 175 SC. I don't know how they plan to use it, but they do in fact have one.
Right, and that's what they fly on the Delta side. It's the same type certificate airplane, the same,
I understand that,
very
right.
similar performance data to the existing 175. All of these, all of the different air carriers, United, Delta, American, all have somewhat slightly different seating configurations, and they all have minor weight differences. That airplane, because it has more of a luxurious interior, also means heavier too. So the weight differences were so minor that it didn't make sense to break that out.
But you indicated that American thought that the 175, not the SC, but the 175 LR was feasible to operate with the existing runway configuration?
The 175 is feasible to operate during certain times of the year and in certain markets. It struggles during the summer months. Also, it has a wingspan that is wider than the CRJ 700, and so if you lose the modification of standard status, then it would not be able to operate in the future unless you bump up to Airport Design Group 3.
But its wingspan is less than 95 feet, is it not?
It's less than 95 feet, but and I'm going to call Mike. What was the number again for the ADG2 max? 79 feet, and the 175 wingspan is roughly around 85 feet. So if you lose that modification standard and you have that 79 feet Group 2 restriction, it wouldn't be able to operate here.
Thank you.
A bit of my concern regards pilot error, pilot recruitment. Those pilots that fly now do less flying and more pushing buttons. They're not seat of the pants pilots anymore. It's got to be a perfect storm when you've got a plane coming in, bailing out at 150 miles an hour. He's got a mere 3 miles at, a number of seconds to make 4,000 vertical to get over to Aspen Mountain, which could have a couple thousand skiers on it. Give me your thoughts. How often is pilot error responsible for deaths or some other measure? How is the recruitment going? And am I overly concerned about pilots not being able to not do the flying that they used to do?
Nice punctuation there. Do you want to start with that one? Sure.
Pilot recruitment is slow because of Congress getting involved after the Continental Express accident and raising minimum flight time for basically first officers, co-pilots to 1,500 hours in an ATP. When I went through college and flew my way through college, I could have got a job with 350, 400 hours in a regional type carrier, cut my teeth, move up to a legacy. Can't do that anymore. Embry-Riddle, my old alma mater, has an exemption. You can get a limited ATP at 1,250 hours, but you're limited into what you can do at a, quote, airline of some sort. So there are still those restrictions. Again, there's a controller shortage, there's a maintenance shortage, maintenance tech shortage, and a lot of it stems from, of course, the pilot salary issue from 15 years ago, where you're getting paid $23,000 a year to fly 75 people behind you. With regard to technology in today's aircraft is awesome. It's also complex. It is mind-numbing if you are not properly trained. And I've been saying this on TV now since Lion Air about the fact that we aren't losing 737 MAX airplanes here in the United States. We aren't losing them in the Western world. Where we're losing them is in third world countries. And the reason for a lot of that is the quality of training. And while we do have a monitoring aspect of automation, the stick flying or hand flying skills of these pilots, we do a better job because of the way we can train, the freedom of our airspace, and the fact that you can get a lot of tactile experience in airplanes, whereas in foreign countries, you go to ground school, you're right into a 737 or an Airbus simulator. The multi-crew pilot license is a perfect example. You never fly by yourself. If you get an MPL license, you're always in a crew from the day you start to the time you're assigned to an airplane. The Ethiopian first officer only had 298 total hours. You'd never see that here in the United States. The concern that I have, and I think that we all share in some form, is the fact, and many of you are pilots, and that is being not only knowledgeable, but understanding of what it is that you need to be doing, not only at the time that you're flying that aircraft in and out of Aspen, but well before. As Wayne said, I mean, when I go to an unfamiliar airport, I go up and look for local information, whether it's NOTAMs, whether it's just local information. That's prudence on the pilot's part. Charter operators, they run the performance. Alec and I talked about this, and that is that there's a group out there that does all the performance planning. When I've got a friend of mine that flies a G4, he sent me all of his performance planning for the operation of the G4 here. It's 12 pages because they have special operating procedures that the company has implemented, and AGP has done all the performance calculations for. There are prudent operators, there are prudent pilots. It is those one-offs. But when you look at the pilot error aspect, I mean, the NTSB statistics will say it's 80%. Remember, I don't care if an engine fails, a human touched that engine. So when you look at it from a human error standpoint, it's 100%.
This question is directed at Wayne. You've been in the tower for an awful long time, and there's been a lot of talk about the pilot training on missed approaches and even bulk landings. My question is, how often does that actually happen at the Aspen Airport? I mean, those of us who are frequent flyers, it's pretty rare that you actually experience a missed approach anywhere. I happen to have the misfortune of being on my last 2 flights into Colorado. Both have missed their approaches, including last night into DIA, as there was a thunderstorm just to the north, and it was an unstabilized approach, and he didn't feel comfortable, so we went up and around and went onto a perpendicular runway. So, it does happen. And my question to you is, how often does it happen here at Aspen? And have you ever, in your experience, actually had an aircraft experience a missed approach and a simultaneous engine failure, which is what they all have to train for?
No, I've never seen an engine failure at Aspen, and that's a good thing. But we still have to train for it, and we have to plan for it. That's part of the safety margin. John's crew is extremely good at keeping the runway clear and clean of deer, bears, and people. So we don't have very many air traffic initiated go-arounds or balk landings. That's a pretty rare thing where we've got to a point where we have to make that decision. When we do see it, it's, first of all, the missed approach is a very different thing from a balk landing. A missed approach happens fairly far out, fairly high off the ground. A pilot determines, I can't see the airport, there's this nice slow climb. So a missed approach is not what we would call a big deal. It's not that uncommon. The fractional aircraft, like the air taxis that we see, they have extremely high minimums, so they miss approach often. They make their decision at 12,000 feet, not at 8,000 or 9,000 feet. So that's a missed approach. So yes, we see a lot of that. We see at the missed approach point, we'll hear aircraft ask for a wind check. We give them a wind check, they go, I don't like that, I'm going to do a missed approach. That's not a big deal. It's a nice, easy climb. It's all mapped out and everything. Where we start talking about sticky stuff is the balk landing or go-around. Air traffic, we call them go-arounds. The industry calls them balk landings. They've made a commitment to the runway, and for whatever reason, a dog, deer, bear, whatever, has gotten on the runway. Now they have to extract themselves from that position from an altitude much lower than the missed approach. And all of our commercial aircraft have very specific instructions on how to do that. They train it. They do it in the simulators until they get it right. They know how to do it. I have the utmost confidence in that. To echo Greg, the GA guys, they probably don't have that simulator time. They also may opt, instead of taking that go-around, saying, I'm more comfortable landing the airplane than taking the go-around. And that looks a lot different. They're under visual conditions at that point, and they have to climb visually around the terrain and come back out and get turned around. These are the airplanes that fly in here every day to day. This isn't a change with the runway, what I'm talking about. This is how it operates day in and day out. Does that answer the question? You want to add to that?
I mean, you answered it perfectly. Again, the situation flying in here or any airport like DIA, like last night, it's dynamic when you have weather and a weather event moving out. If you're, I mean, you were here for the G3.
I missed that one. I was here for the challenge.
Well, he was in trail by behind two other airplanes that had gone missed on the approach. As he came in, a snow squall had moved through, so it obscured, his vision to the runway, and he continued through that obscuration. I call it hinting and hoping, where, they hope that they're going to break out and see it, and when they did, unfortunately, they were offset and tried to correct a bad situation rather than power up, pull up, and get out. You are going to have that kind of mentality. It's not every day. It's 1 in a billion possibly, but the fact is that it's accountable for all of us in this safety equation in an environment like Aspen.
All right, I would like to give our panelists a hand. Thank you so much.
So let's get started. I'm going to, as quickly as I can, walk through the outcomes, the results of the April 29th meeting, in which we broke into small groups and identified what we thought of as core or guiding community principles that should help us, that should help inform the airport design process. When we went through our notes from that April meeting, 9 what I'll call umbrella values or community value themes really stood out in what we heard from multiple people in multiple working groups. Within each of these value themes, we recorded your additional comments, which I'm going to go through to add more color to what people meant when they talked about a particular community value. So here are the value themes we heard in multiple comments on April 29. And when I talk about them, I'm going to use the actual words that we heard in the meeting, or either in the notes and in the recordings, the tapes that exist from those meetings. The one at the top is, of course, safety in the air and on the ground. That's kind of the sine qua non. It's the reason we're here today, and it will, must, and shall be reflected in any kind of airport design that goes forward. Next is adaptable, flexible, and future-proof. People talked about the ability to serve the aircraft of the future, that an aircraft, commercial aircraft in 20 or 30 years may be quite different in some respects from commercial aircraft today. We need to be flexible to accommodate that. And we need the ability to adapt to future uses, preserving space for the future in an airport. Environmental responsibility, you spoke of addressing noise pollution, air pollution, carbon emissions. Several people brought up an aspiration to carbon neutrality, net neutrality, light pollution, sustainability and energy efficiency, seamless multimodal transit connections, that came up over and over, respect for wildlife habitat, open space, and natural surroundings. The next value theme is community character, reflecting local culture and values. People spoke of a connection to place. It should feel like Aspen and Pitkin County was something we heard multiple times. It should have a unique mountain airport feeling. It should be unpretentious. It should tell the Aspen story, reflect the culture, the mining heritage, skiing, ranching, and all of that story that makes Aspen special should be reflected in the terminal. The terminal should retain our rural and small town feel. Sample comments, small is important, don't build it too big, 1 story above ground, reasonable growth, modest expansion, control growth through the number of gates. And 2 key phrases came up over and over from multiple people in more than one breakout group, and those were talking about the terminal, just big enough, and the second is right-sized. The next value theme is economic vitality. Adaptable to the economic sustainability of our resort was one quote from one of you. Convenience, more direct flights, more carriers and competition. Take valley growth into consideration. The next value theme is warm and welcoming. Should be the terminal, the airport, and especially the terminal, should be friendly and personable to both residents and visitors. It should be comfortable with excellent food and drink amenities. It should be guest-friendly for stranded passengers and peak crowds. And to the extent possible, it should be stress-free, although that might be an oxymoron with any airport. It should be improved, but it was, one person said, improved but not so different from today, and someone else said, still welcoming. A lot of people talked about great views of the mountains from any new terminal. It should be a practical airport, better waiting rooms and employee areas, and it should be convenient with easy ground transportation. Design excellence is a theme. Should be unique, distinctive, great architecture. Again, it should look like Aspen. Small is important, small but beautiful. Incorporate mountain surroundings. A number of people, not everyone, but a number of people said no jet bridges. Awe-inspiring views. It should be surprising, as one person put it. Efficiency, an airport that works well. Should be well-planned, better functionality than today. Should incorporate new technology. Should be efficient in service, time, and operations. In design, it should give commercial passengers priority over private planes. Should be a reliable gateway for visitors. And it should, once again, have convenient ground transportation, multimodal transit options. As I read that, I'm thinking that maybe we need a 10th value theme, because that one really does come up a lot. Preserve high quality of life. This is the last of these themes. It should be neighbor-friendly. It should mitigate and control noise. And we should maintain the curfew. So those are the community value themes we heard from you on April 29th. I'll note 2 obvious and unsurprising things. The first is, not everyone shared every value. You might have guessed that. The second is that some values tend to conflict with others. Another pretty obvious thing. The key to our work beginning in July, beginning next month, is going to be to find the right balance between these values and to begin to determine their relative priority as we apply them directly to airport design. With that, let's break out into our working groups where we're gonna talk a bit about what we just heard about airport safety, and we're also gonna give you a preview of the exercise in July when we really do start applying these values directly to airport design.